They asked me if I'd talk a little bit about the livestock perspective of antimicrobial restrictions and what that meant. And in order to do that, I also have to give a bit of a caveat in that I was on a plane a couple of months ago, and a lady sat down next to me and she asked what I did, and I said, well, I'm a swine veterinarian. And she looked at me and her eyes got real big and she said, oh, those are lovely birds. But she said, you know, I didn't know swans had their own veterinarians. So I realized my response to that should have been to correct her, being the communication director, but I decided I would just go with it and spent the next 20 minutes answering her questions about why the birds changed from black to white and why the birds couldn't fly backwards, which I thought was an interesting question. So my caveat is that other than my expertise in swine medicine and pretend expertise in swan medicine, I pretend no other expertise in any other livestock group. So there are others out there who can give you a better perspective on some of the other livestock industries. Mine's mainly going to be swine-centric, but I think some of the issues that we face are very similar within the livestock industries. So we heard a little bit yesterday about legislation versus regulation, and I think everybody in here understands the differences there, that legislations are the laws that are created by Congress, and the individual agencies then develop the regulation that's necessary to implement those laws. And, you know, when we try to advocate for antimicrobial use issues, we operate within both of those arenas, and certainly I think, as was indicated yesterday, our preference would be to operate within that regulatory realm rather than the legislative realm, but unfortunately we're forced to do both. A couple of the key legislative things that have been implemented over the years that I wanted to bring up were in 1938, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is really the one that gave FDA the responsibility and the oversight for safety of food, drugs, and cosmetics. And of course, this act has been amended many times since its implementation in 1938. Another key act was the AMDUCA, or the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act of 1994, which, from a veterinary standpoint, is the one that allowed us the privilege of using antimicrobials in an extra label manner and prescribed exactly how we were able to do that. So if we talk a little bit about the proposed legislation that many of you, all of you probably have heard about, and we heard a little bit about this yesterday as well, the most prominent one that's out there now is PAMTA, or the Preservation of Antibiotics for Medical Treatment Act. This was introduced in March 2011 by Representative Louise Slaughter. It's a repeat of legislation that's been introduced over a number of years and has never actually made it all the way through to the point of law. The reason that I guess that we have some heartburn about this type of legislation is really it's in the wording, and the words are always important, but I pulled this right out of the purpose for the act, and it says that the purpose of this act is to preserve the effectiveness of medically important antibiotics used in the treatment of human and animal diseases by reviewing the safety of certain antibiotics for non-therapeutic purposes in food-producing animals. And there's a couple of parts of that I think are critically important to understand, and that being who defines what's medically important and what does this act actually mean with regards to non-therapeutic. If we look at the term critically or medically important antimicrobial drug, it's really a pretty broad definition within the purposes of this act. It's basically it's talking about a drug that is composed wholly or partly of any kind of all of these common compounds that we all use throughout our practice: penicillin, tetracyclines, macrolides, lincosamides, streptogramins, aminoglycosides, and sulfonamides. But it goes even beyond that to say that it's any other drug or derivative of a drug that is used in humans or intended for use in humans to treat or prevent disease or infection caused by microorganisms. So ultimately that's a pretty broad definition of an antimicrobial, I think. We being AASV, collaborated with Dr. Mike Apley at Kansas State, as well as Randy Singer. I don't know if Randy's still here or not, but as well as USDA, on trying to put forward some realistic estimate of antimicrobial use in the swine industry in the U.S. This was published back in March of this year. And the effort here was really twofold. One was to develop a response to some of these outlandish numbers that we hear tossed around out there about the volume of use of antimicrobials in livestock, and in this case specifically in swine production. But the second part was actually to describe how antimicrobials are actually used in the swine industry today. So if you take a look at that, you'll see that we have a number of charts in there, and I wanted to pull this one up that highlights the antimicrobials that we use that would fall into that category of either highly important or critically important as defined by the Guidance 152 and FDA. And certainly there are a number of common compounds there that are used either for growth promotion, prevention, or therapy. We didn't, in this study, we didn't differentiate between prevention and control, but this sort of outlines some of those common products and the level that they're used. The other term that really concerns us, I think, in PAMTA is this use of the term non-therapeutic antimicrobial. And basically, how they define that is a drug that's used in animals' feed or water for an animal in the absence of any clinical sign of disease, or for weight gain, growth promotion, and routine disease prevention or other routine purpose. And that's where we really start getting concerned, is that if these drugs are taken away for the use of prevention, then that's another tool out of our toolbox to try to prevent the onslaught of a disease in a herd or a population. The other proposed act that's out there that's just come up over the last couple of months is an effort by Representative Henry Waxman to require FDA or to mandate FDA to improve the types of data collection that they do. Currently, FDA is required to report sales data for antimicrobials, but this act, if imposed, would go way beyond that and would require feed mills to report antibiotics that they use in their feed, as well as to require the drug manufacturers to report to the Food and Drug Administration the type, purpose, and quantities of antimicrobials that are used on the farm. And I think that these two factors, to the level that this act tries to get at, are extremely difficult, if not impossible, for feed mills and drug manufacturers to actually respond to that in any meaningful sort of way. The only way to get at that level of granularity is actual on-farm investigation. So that's another one that we're going to be watching carefully. As I said, the concerns with that proposed act are sales data doesn't always correlate very well with on-farm use, and I think we all recognize that. Feed mills and manufacturers are not going to be able to really provide the level of granularity that this act is looking for, I don't think. So if we look then to some of the regulatory side of things, a couple of the guidance documents that you've heard about already during this conference would be FDA Guidance 209 and 213. Which basically define production. 209 in particular provides production uses or growth promotion, feed efficiency uses to be injudicious. They didn't come out and say that those uses were unsafe. They came out and said they were injudicious. And as we talked about earlier today, that's a big question, is how do you define judicious use? So they also require enhanced veterinary oversight in the use of feed-grade antimicrobials, and but it's basically a voluntary removal of these growth promotion claims from the labels. So they're looking at manufacturers to voluntarily take those approved uses off the labels, and it looks like the time frame of that is going to be within a 3-year time period after the adoption of Guidance 213. And the other part of this is transitioning most of the over-the-counter feed-grade antimicrobials to a veterinary feed directive, which the swine industry and swine veterinarians have had quite a bit of experience dealing with veterinary feed directives. Most of the other species groups have not. So there's going to be challenges as we move more of these antimicrobials into that veterinary feed directive mechanism of training veterinarians and producers what's really involved with that program. So the question is, can you regulate a reduction in the use of antimicrobials? And I think the answer to that is, yeah, you probably can. If we look at the Danish work, for instance, on reductions of antimicrobial use in swine production there, this is a chart, compilation of charts out of their DanMap reports. This was actually drawn, this chart in total was actually drawn from a Nature article back in June. But basically what you see here is in the dark blue bars are the growth promotion, the amount of growth promoting antimicrobials that were used prior to the ban in swine in Denmark. The lighter blue bars were the amount of therapeutic products that were used. And as you can see, back in 1994 is when Denmark banned the ability of veterinarians to profit from the sale of antimicrobials, thinking that that would drive the use of antimicrobials down. You saw some decline at that point, but probably not a really significant change. If you look then in 98 and 2000, they implemented bans on the use of antimicrobials in grow finish areas and then in the nursery area of swine production. And of course, at that point, once it became illegal, the growth promotion use went to zero. But if you'll notice, from 2000 on to 2009, we see a pretty continued increase in the actual therapeutic use of antimicrobials per kilogram of meat that's produced. So in 2010, not being able to get the results they were hoping to get, they instituted what they called a yellow card scheme, which basically established thresholds above which veterinarians and producers could not exceed that use of antimicrobials on their farm, or there were consequences subject to doing that. And following that, that legal reduction or regulation, we have seen a reduction in the use of antimicrobials, but still today the level of therapeutic antimicrobials are significantly greater than what the therapeutic levels were before. And you see this, what I would call an artificial reduction. Obviously it makes you wonder at what cost to the welfare or the health of the animals that we're dealing with, as well as potential food safety concerns associated with that. This just describes a little bit about that yellow card system and what the implications were. If we talk a little bit about the Veterinary Feed Directive and the effort to move over-the-counter feed-grade antimicrobials to the VFD, FDA, I think, has been very good about recognizing that there are changes needed to make that VFD more user-friendly and particularly if they're going to spread that over more species and a broader number of antimicrobials. And they've had this out for comment for some time and have received a number of comments, and it looks like that some of the revisions they're considering are very well thought. And I've listed some of those here about how you deal with dosage, duration, refills, things like that. Trying to estimate the approximate number of animals treated rather than previously you had to estimate the tonnage of feed that you were going to prescribe. That was always a very difficult thing from a swine perspective. Making some changes regarding how the forms can actually be distributed and submitted, I think, are good. Record retention for a 12-year period versus longer periods that had originally been prescribed, and then decoupling the VFD process from the veterinary client-patient relationship. And you heard a little bit earlier about the VCPR, and I think the VCPR is a very important aspect of veterinary medicine and the relationship between the veterinarian and the producer. FDA felt that it was a good idea to decouple this from the VFD because the VCPR in its codified form is related directly to AMDUCA, or the Extra Label Drug Use Act, and was added to the VFD when the VFD was proposed. But their consideration is that requiring a VCPR for a VFD actually raises the level of requirement for the VFD even above that of what's required for a prescription, and they don't feel that that's really where they want to be with the VFD. There have been some efforts lately to change the wording on the VCPR. As I said, the codified version in the CFR is a requirement for AMDUCA. AVMA recently has adopted some change in wording there as part of their Model Veterinary Practice Act, and it also appears now as part of a number of state veterinary practice acts, which means ultimately you've got a number of different versions out there that sort of confuses where you need to be as a veterinarian in complying with those parts of the various acts. So all in all, what's driving the current push towards legislation and regulation relative to antimicrobial use? And I think it's, to a large extent, it's the sphere of resistance development in the human population. But generally speaking, I think that the proposed responses to that are disproportionate to the actual hazard that we see. If you look at the assessments that have been done, they often ignore what I think is the other side of that equation, the risk-benefit. They ignore the benefit side of that equation and don't put a lot of perspective into what the risk assessments actually show. So if we try to put a little science to that, if we look at FDA's Guidance 152, it called for evaluating the risk in order to establish a reasonable certainty of no harm. It didn't say no risk. Nothing that we do on a daily basis has a zero risk. So you have to differentiate between things that might happen and things that are likely to happen. And you have to keep in mind that there's a lot of steps between applying that antimicrobial to a food-producing animal and getting any resistance that might develop there all the way through the production and the food chain out to the consumer, and it ultimately resulting in any significant increase in human harm, be it increased illness days or mortality or whatever. So you have to balance that ultimate potential hazard with what the risk seems to be at the start. And I think Scott Hurd loaned me this slide. I think this does a good job sort of establishing that causal pathway. You know, he takes that from antibiotic use in livestock through the development of resistance. You have to get the pathogen on the meat, resulting in some sort of human illness that's then attempted to be addressed with antibiotic treatment, and then the quote-unquote failure of that treatment actually results in some negative consequence to the human being at the end. So if we look at risk-benefit, looking at the other half of the equation, Scott also did a nice study recently that looked at peel-out carcasses and found, and we heard a little bit about this yesterday as well, but found that those carcasses were 90% more likely to be contaminated with salmonella. And Randy Singer also did a nice study back in 2007 that basically showed that relatively minor changes in the microbial load due to reduced poultry health could have relatively large impacts on human health. So I think that the point there is that utilizing these products, these drugs, in a judicious manner can actually result in food safety improvements at the end of the day. It's not the only thing that contributes to that, but it is a tool that we have in our toolbox now to aid in improving that. And if we look at the FDA data from 2009, we can see that there's been almost a third reduction in the incidence of foodborne illnesses in the U.S. So I think we've got a good story to tell there. So far, all of the risk assessments, the scientific risk assessments that I'm aware of that have been conducted to date have shown that the risk that's associated with antimicrobial use in livestock to be low or near zero. So a really infinitesimally small risk associated with the antimicrobial use, and I think we've heard other people talk about this. But if we look at, again, this is a compilation of some studies that Scott Hurd put together. If we look at the risk of various antimicrobial uses on the left-hand side there to the potential for a measured outcome on the right-hand side, the center column sort of shows what that risk probability is. And that the first one there, looking at enrofloxacin, a 1 in 30,000 chance of compromised treatment, was a study conducted by FDA that, there's some question regarding how they estimated the attributable fraction associated with that finding, and I would say that risk assessment is considerably low. Cox and Popkin did another study looking at enrofloxacin in poultry and found ultimately that the removal was actually more hazardous to health than continuing with the current usages. But if we look at some of the other studies that have been done, risk assessments that have been done, and what the relative risks findings were in those, you can see it's macrolide uses in cattle, swine, and poultry, you're talking 1 in 10 million of a potential compromised treatment. Streptogramins and Virginiamycin use, approximately 100 and 100 million for an impaired treatment. Penicillin growth promoters, approximately 4 in a billion in excess mortality. And Baytril in dairy heifers, approximately 1 in 61 billion for compromised treatment. So, if you put those into perspective, how many people drove here today or drove to get to this meeting? I mean, you folks are, you're living on the edge. I mean, I can't believe you really thought getting to this meeting was worth the risk, but you're talking a 1 in 6,700 chance of dying as a result of a car crash. Commercial plane crashes, 1 in a quarter in 100,000 flight hours. Bicycling, 1 in 141,000. Running, 1 in 1 million. So obviously I've looked at this and considered the risk of that exercise to be way too great to actually partake in any of that. But even going to a dance party, did you realize that there's a 1 in 100 million chance that you would die going to a dance party now? Leah can tell you I have got some killer dance moves, but I didn't realize I was really at risk. So. But if we take that and put it into some serious perspective, what are we really trying to do here? And if you look at some of the estimates for what the world's going to look like in 2050, we're talking a population of 9 billion requiring in excess of 100% more food. The FAO estimates that at least 70% of that additional food is going to have to come from efficiency improving technologies. The judicious, appropriate use of antimicrobials is one of those efficiency improving technologies. It's not the only thing that's going to contribute to all of this, again, but it's one of those tools that we have at risk, taking those out of the toolbox. Again, if we put that in perspective, 1 in 6 people went hungry in 2010, according to the FAO. That's over 1 billion people. 43% of the global population lives on less than $2 US a day. That's 3 billion people, according to UNICEF in 2011. And what has the swine industry done to improve that efficiency over the last 50 years? They've reduced the usage of water 41%, land use down 78%, and the carbon footprint is reduced 35%. This is the issue we're talking about. I mean, this is the effort that agriculture is putting forward today. And there are those that say, well, we're not worried about feeding the world, and that may be the perspective. But the fact of the matter is that we are gaining efficiencies and trying to capitalize on those efficiencies. So economics are associated with this as well. What is the economic impact of antimicrobial growth promotion loss within the swine industry? Dermot Hayes at Iowa State and Helen Jensen examined results that they saw from Denmark post implementation of those bans, as well as a Swedish study that was done, and they extrapolated some of those findings to try to estimate what the economic impact of a similar ban might be on U.S. swine producers. And what they found was, when they looked at all of these various factors, weaning costs, finishing costs, increased veterinary costs, vaccine, sort loss, all of that, basically during the first year of such a ban, they estimated it would cost approximately $4.50 per animal in the swine industry for that, to make up for that loss of antimicrobial growth promotants. What does that equate to over a 10-year time period? That's approximately $700 million. The increased cost to consumers would be approximately 2% additional on retail. The other thing that they estimated was you're going to see that increased cost for production. It's going to result in a decreased amount of production, and ultimately some producers would go out of business as a result of that. So to wrap this up, when we're talking to people that are willing to listen about what the science message is going to be, we try to leave them with 4 points, basically. Number one is that the scientific risk assessments that have been published to date have shown that the risk associated with the feeding of antimicrobials to livestock, that risk to humans is negligible at best. Number two, the failure to prevent or treat animal illnesses causes a significant increase in animal welfare concerns, as well as unnecessary suffering and death. Number three is that animals with residual effects of disease are more likely to cause human foodborne illness. We already talked about a couple of studies that I think show that risk to be real. And lastly, the point that we tried to make in that study that we did with Kansas State and with Minnesota was that the volume of use, everybody likes to throw out these huge numbers of, this amount of antimicrobials is used in livestock versus in the human population, and that's bad. But the volume actually has very little, if any, relevance to the resistance development discussion. Really what we need to be focusing on there, and the point we try to leave with them, is that the key focus needs to be at that level of the bug-drug interaction. And then you have to evaluate, if a resistance develops at that point, what is the subsequent potential hazard to the human being at the end of that chain.